The knock on Alara's door came before the sun had even risen, and it was not a gentle knock. It was hard, fast, and impatient, the kind of knock that made her drop the needle she was holding and press a hand to her chest. She opened the door to find 2 armed guards standing in the cold morning air, their faces blank, their armor catching the weak light. "You are Alara, the seamstress," one of them said. It was not a question. "Yes," she answered, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "You are needed at the palace, now." Alara had lived in the lower village her whole life, in a small house with a single window and a table covered in thread and cloth. She had never once been called to the palace. She had never wanted to be. The palace belonged to the Alpha King, a man whose name alone made grown men lower their eyes. People said he had not smiled since the day he took the throne. People said his temper had ended lives. She had heard so many stories about him that she no longer knew which ones were true, and which ones were only fear dressed up as gossip. "Why me?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "His cloak was torn in battle last night. He needs it repaired before midday. You were recommended." She wanted to ask who had recommended her, and why, but the guards were already turning, expecting her to follow. She grabbed her sewing basket, her hands shaking, and stepped out into a morning that suddenly felt far too bright and far too dangerous. The walk to the palace took longer than she expected, winding uphill through streets that grew wider and cleaner the closer they came to the towering gates. Alara had seen the palace from a distance many times, a shape of stone and shadow rising above the village, like something that did not belong to the same world as her small house. Up close, it was worse. The walls were higher than she imagined, the guards more numerous, the silence heavier. Along the way, she passed market stalls just beginning to open, bakers setting out their first loaves, a boy leading a tired horse toward the well. None of them noticed her. None of them knew that within the hour she would be standing before the most feared man in the kingdom. Part of her wished she could stop and tell someone, anyone, where she was being taken, in case she never returned. But the guards walked too quickly for conversation, and soon the market noise faded behind her, replaced by the growing shadow of the palace walls. Inside, the halls were cold, despite the fires burning in every corner. Servants moved quickly and quietly, none of them meeting her eyes. She was led through corridor after corridor, until she reached a set of tall doors, guarded by 2 men, who looked as though they had never once relaxed in their lives.
"Wait here,"
one of the guards who had brought her said, and then he knocked twice and disappeared inside. Alara stood alone in the hallway, clutching her basket, trying to steady her breathing. She thought of turning back, of running down the corridor and out through the gates, and never looking at the palace again. But she knew what would happen if she tried. No one refused the Alpha King. No one who wanted to keep breathing, at least. The doors opened again, and she was waved inside. The room she entered was larger than her entire house. Tall windows lined one wall, letting in cold light that fell across a stone floor polished so well she could almost see her reflection in it. And at the far end of the room, standing with his back to her, was a man she recognized immediately, without ever having seen him before. He was tall, broader than any man she had ever stood near, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and shoulders that seemed built to carry more weight than any person should have to carry. He wore no crown, no ornament, to announce his position, but something in the way he stood told her everything she needed to know. This was Cade, the Alpha King. Alara had imagined him 100 different ways over the years, shaped by every rumor that drifted down into the lower village. Some said he was a monster wearing the shape of a man. Some said he had not spoken a kind word to another living soul since the day his father died and left him the crown. Others said his eyes could see straight through a person, find every lie they carried, every fear they tried to hide. Standing in front of him now, she understood why the stories had grown so large. There was something about him that made the room feel smaller, made the air feel thinner, as though his presence alone pressed against the walls. And yet, he had not raised his voice. He had not moved to threaten her. He simply stood, watching, waiting, as though he had all the time in the world and she was the only thing worth spending it on. He turned slowly, and when his eyes met hers, Alara felt something she had not expected. Not fear, though fear was there too, curled tightly beneath her ribs. Something else. His eyes were a pale, sharp gray, the color of a sky before a storm, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made it impossible to do so. You are the seamstress, he said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command a room. Yes, my lord, Ilara. He did not offer his own name. He did not need to. He simply gestured toward a chair near the window, where a cloak lay draped over the back, torn along one side in a long, jagged line. Even from where she stood, Ilara could see the tear was not clean. It had not been made by careful hands. It had been torn in violence. Fix it, he said. Before midday. She moved toward the chair, grateful for a task that gave her hands something to do besides tremble. She lifted the cloak and examined the fabric, thick, dark wool, lined with something softer beneath. Expensive in a way she had only ever imagined. The tear ran nearly the length of her forearm, jagged at the edges, as though claws or a blade had caught the fabric and dragged. How did this happen? She asked, before she could stop herself. The king did not answer right away. When she looked up, his expression had shifted into something unreadable, something guarded. That is not your concern, he said. Your concern is the needle in your hand. Ilara nodded quickly and lowered her eyes back to the cloak, cursing herself silently for asking. She threaded her needle, calmer now that she had something familiar to hold on to, and began to work. The rhythm of it steadied her, the small motions she had performed 1,000 times before, over 1,000 different pieces of cloth for 1,000 different people, who never once made her feel the way this room made her feel. She was aware, the entire time, that he was watching her. He did not pretend otherwise. He stood near the window, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on her hands as they moved. It should have unsettled her more than it did. Instead, there was something almost calming about his stillness, the way he did not pace, or fidget, or speak unnecessarily. He simply watched, as though her steady hands were the only steady thing in a room that otherwise felt heavy with things unsaid. You are not afraid of me, he said eventually. It was not quite a question. Ilara's needle paused for half a second before continuing. I am afraid, my lord. You do not show it. Showing it would not help the stitching, she said, and then immediately wondered if she had spoken too freely. She braced herself for anger, for the temper the whole village whispered about. Instead, something almost like amusement passed briefly over his face, there and gone so quickly she nearly missed it. No, he agreed quietly. It would not. The silence that followed was different from the one before it, less sharp. She kept working, pulling the torn edges of the cloak together, her stitches small and even, the kind of work she took pride in, even when her circumstances gave her little else to be proud of. She could feel the weight of his attention on her, but it no longer felt entirely like danger. It felt like something she did not have a name for yet. You live in the lower village, he said. Yes, my lord. Alone? The question startled her enough that she looked up. His expression gave nothing away, but there was a quality to the question that felt less like idle curiosity, and more like something he genuinely wanted to know. My mother passed 2 winters ago, she said carefully. I have lived alone since. He did not offer sympathy, and she was strangely grateful for that. Sympathy from strangers had always felt hollow to her, a formality people performed rather than truly felt. His silence, instead, felt like respect for a fact stated plainly. You do fine work, he said instead, nodding toward her hands. Thank you, my lord. Cade, he said. She blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. My lord? My name, he said. Cade, you may use it when we are alone. The offer hung strangely in the air between them, too intimate for the circumstances, too sudden for a man everyone described as cold and untouchable. Ilara did not know how to respond, so she simply nodded and returned her attention to the cloak, though her fingers were no longer quite as steady as they had been a moment before. She finished the repair as the sun climbed higher outside the tall windows, the stitches tight and nearly invisible against the dark wool. She held the cloak out for his inspection, and he took it from her, his fingers brushing briefly against hers as he did. It was the smallest of contacts, barely anything at all, and yet Ilara felt it travel up her arm like a spark. He examined the stitching closely, turning the fabric over, running his thumb along the mended tier. This is good work, he said finally. Thank you, my lord. Cade, she corrected herself, and immediately flushed at her own boldness. Something shifted in his expression again. That same flicker of near amusement from before, softer this time. "You may go," he said, though there was a hesitation in the words, something that made her wonder if he had meant to say something else entirely. She gathered her basket and turned toward the door, relief and something else, something she could not quite name, tangled together in her chest. She had survived her first meeting with the Alpha King. She had not expected to feel anything other than fear when it ended. She had not expected to feel reluctant to leave. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Ilara." She turned. He stood exactly where she had left him, the mended cloak draped over one arm, his gray eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I may require your services again," he said. It was a simple sentence, spoken plainly, the kind of thing a nobleman might say to any craftsman he intended to hire again. And yet something in the way he said it, something in the weight behind the words, told Ilara that this was not simply about torn cloaks or careful stitching. "Of course, my lord," she said softly, "whenever you need me." She left the room with her basket clutched tightly to her chest, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear of punishment, and everything to do with the memory of gray eyes that had watched her far longer than any simple repair required. The walk back through the palace corridors felt different from the walk in. The servants who had avoided her eyes before now glanced at her with open curiosity, whispering behind their hands the moment she passed. She did not understand it at first, and then it struck her. No one summoned to mend a single cloak left the king's private chamber, with a promise of being called again. Word traveled fast within stone walls. By the time she reached the outer gates, she could feel the weight of a dozen unspoken questions following her out into the morning air. Outside, the village looked exactly as she had left it, hours before, small and familiar, and untouched by the strange world she had just stepped out of. She walked home slowly, her basket heavy on her arm, her mind replaying every moment of the meeting, the way his voice had softened when he spoke his own name, the brief warmth of his fingers against hers, the question about whether she lived alone. By the time she reached her small house and closed the door behind her, the sun had risen fully, spilling gold light across her worn table and scattered thread. She sat down heavily in her chair, staring at nothing, trying to convince herself that what she felt was only the lingering shock of fear, nothing more. But when she closed her eyes, it was not fear she saw. It was gray eyes, steady and unreadable, watching her hands move across torn fabric, as though nothing else in the world mattered. Behind her, in the quiet of that vast stone room, the Alpha King stood alone, staring down at the mended cloak in his hands, wondering why the thought of her leaving had unsettled him more than any battle he had ever fought. The second summons came only 3 days later, and this time, Ilara was not dragged from her bed at dawn. Instead, a young servant girl arrived at her door in the early afternoon, polite and nervous, carrying a folded note bearing the royal seal. Ilara's hands trembled as she broke it open, half expecting bad news, half expecting nothing at all. The note was short. Cade required her presence again. No explanation was given. She dressed carefully this time, though she owned little worth choosing between, and made her way up the hill toward the palace, with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation twisting in her stomach. She told herself it was simply more mending work, another torn garment, nothing more. She told herself this several times, and did not fully believe it once. When she arrived, she was led through the same corridors as before, though this time the servants who passed her seemed to look at her longer, their expressions harder to read. She wondered what they had heard, what stories had already begun to spread, about the seamstress who had been called back to the king's chambers so soon. Inside the same tall room, Cade stood near the window again, though this time he was not alone. A tall man in dark armor stood beside him, his face weathered and serious, a long scar running down one side of his jaw. He turned as Ilara entered, studying her with open suspicion. "This is her?" the man asked, his voice rough. "This is her," Cade said simply. "Ilara, this is General Doran. He commands my forces." Ilara offered a small, uncertain bow. Doran did not return the gesture. His eyes lingered on her for a long moment before he turned back to Cade. "You called a seamstress here to discuss this?" Doran asked, his tone edged with disbelief. "She has already seen the cloak," Cade said. "She will see more before this is finished." Ilara felt a chill settle over her, despite the warmth of the fire burning nearby. She did not understand what was being discussed, but the tension between the two men was unmistakable, thick enough to fill the entire room. "My lord," she said carefully, "perhaps I should return another time, if you have matters to discuss." "Stay," Cade said, without looking at her. The single word left no room for argument. Doran's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more about her presence. Instead, he unrolled a length of parchment across a nearby table, revealing a map marked with symbols Elara did not recognize, small crossed lines near the northern border, a cluster of marks near a river she had only ever heard named in passing. "The attack came from here," Doran said, pointing to a spot near the river. "Whoever did this knew exactly where our patrol would be. That is not chance, Cade. That is knowledge only someone close to us could have given." Elara stood very still, understanding now, at least in part, what had torn the king's cloak 3 days before. Not simple battle, not an ordinary skirmish. Something planned, something with betrayal woven into its very bones. "You believe someone within the pack gave this information away," Cade said. It was not a question. "I believe it strongly," Doran said. "And I believe you already suspect the same, or you would not have kept this seamstress so close after a single mending." Elara's breath caught. She had not expected to be spoken of so directly, as though her presence itself were part of whatever strategy the two men were weighing. Cade's gray eyes flicked toward her briefly, before returning to the map. "Elara has nothing to do with pack matters." "Then why is she here for this conversation?" Doran pressed. The question hung heavy in the air. Elara watched Cade's jaw tighten, the same way Doran's had moments before, and she realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that the Alpha King did not have a ready answer. Whatever his true reason for keeping her near, he had not yet found words for it, not even to himself. "She stays because I have ordered it," Cade said finally, his voice sharpening. "That is reason enough." Doran did not argue further, though the look he gave Elara before returning his attention to the map was long and considering, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not yet fit together. Elara lowered her eyes to the floor, uncomfortable beneath the weight of his scrutiny, wishing she understood even a fraction of what was truly happening around her. The conversation continued for some time, discussing troop movements, possible suspects, names Elara did not recognize, spoken with varying degrees of suspicion. She listened quietly, absorbing more than she was meant to, aware that whatever she overheard in this room was not meant for ears like hers. And yet Cade made no move to send her away, even as the discussion grew more pointed, more dangerous in its implications. At one point, Doran mentioned a name, Lord Callum, spoken with particular weight, and Elara noticed Cade's shoulders stiffen slightly, though his expression remained otherwise unreadable. "Callum has been loyal for years," Cade said. "Loyalty can wear thin," Doran replied, "especially when ambition grows louder than duty." Elara did not know who Lord Callum was, but she filed the name away regardless, some instinct telling her it would matter later, though she could not have said why. Doran continued, tapping a finger against the parchment. 3 patrols in 2 months, Cade. Each one ambushed at precisely the moment they were most vulnerable. That is not misfortune. That is a pattern, and patterns require someone feeding information from within these walls. "I am aware of the pattern," Cade said, his voice low and controlled, though Elara could sense the effort it took to keep it that way. "What I am not aware of is proof." "Proof will come," Doran said, "but by the time it does, how many more soldiers will we have lost? How many more of our own people will pay for our patience?" Cade said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the map as though the answer might be hidden somewhere among its lines and markings. Elara watched him carefully, noticing the way his hands rested against the table's edge, not clenched, but tense, as though he were holding something back through sheer will alone. "I will not accuse a man of my counsel without evidence," Cade said finally. "Not even Callum, not even if suspicion points toward him. An accusation without proof creates its own kind of chaos, and chaos is exactly what our enemies want from us right now." Doran exhaled sharply through his nose, clearly frustrated, though he did not argue further. "Then we watch him. Quietly." "Quietly," Cade agreed. The conversation shifted, then to matters of border patrol schedules. Changes meant to disrupt whatever pattern the enemy had learned to predict. Elara understood little of the specific strategy, but she understood the weight of it, the way both men spoke with the careful precision of people who knew lives depended on their choices. It struck her, standing quietly at the edge of the room, how heavy a crown truly was, far heavier than any story from the village had ever suggested. The Alpha King everyone feared was also a man carrying the survival of his people on shoulders that, however broad, were still only human beneath the title. When the meeting finally ended, Doran rolled the map closed and left without another glance in her direction, his footsteps heavy and deliberate against the stone floor. The moment the door shut behind him, the room felt suddenly quieter, the tension that had filled it easing, though not entirely disappearing. "You should not have heard any of that," Cade said, turning to face her fully, for the first time since Doran's arrival. "I did not mean to," Elara said honestly. "You asked me to stay." "I know what I asked." His voice was quieter now, almost frustrated, though not at her. "I am not certain why I asked it." Elara did not know how to respond to such an admission, spoken so plainly by a man everyone described as guarded beyond reason. She busied her hands with the strap of her basket instead, unsure what to do with the sudden vulnerability in his tone. "Is the kingdom in danger?" she asked quietly. Cade was silent for a long moment before answering. "There are those who wish to see me removed from this throne. There always have been. Lately, the attempts have grown bolder. And you believe someone close to you is helping them." "I believe it is possible," he said, "and that possibility makes trust a very expensive thing right now." Elara considered his words carefully. "Then why trust me? You know nothing about me beyond a single afternoon of stitching." Something flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "That is a fair question," he admitted. "I do not have a good answer for it." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than any temper or coldness could have. She had expected many things from the Alpha King: cruelty, distance, indifference. She had not expected uncertainty, worn so openly in front of a stranger from the lower village. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "trust does not always require a good reason. Perhaps sometimes it simply happens, whether we understand it or not." Cade studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his gray eyes, something she could not quite name. "Perhaps," he echoed quietly. Before either of them could say more, a sharp knock interrupted the moment, and a servant entered, bowing quickly. "My lord, there has been another incident along the eastern road. General Doran requests your presence immediately." Cade's expression hardened instantly, the brief softness of moments before vanishing beneath the weight of his role. "Send word that I am coming." The servant hurried away, and Cade turned back to Elara, his features once again composed into the controlled mask she had first seen 3 days ago. "You should return home," he said. "It is not safe here today." "Is it safe anywhere, my lord, if someone close to you means harm?" He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "No," he admitted quietly. "Perhaps it is not." He escorted her personally to the outer hall, an act she suspected was unusual, given the way the guards straightened sharply at his approach, their eyes widening slightly, before schooling back into practiced neutrality. At the doors, he paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her chest tighten all over again. "Be careful on your walk home," he said. "I will, my lord." "Cade," he corrected softly. "Cade," she repeated, and something in his expression eased, just slightly, before he turned and strode back into the palace, leaving her standing alone at the threshold, her mind full of maps and betrayal and gray eyes that seemed to carry far more weight than any crown ever could. The walk home felt longer than usual, her thoughts tangled between fear for a kingdom she barely understood and a growing awareness that she had stepped into something far larger than mended cloaks. She passed the same market stalls as before, the same bakers and merchants calling out their wares, and yet everything looked different to her now, smaller somehow, as though she had glimpsed a world behind the visible one and could no longer unsee it. She thought of Lord Callum, a name she had never heard before that afternoon, and wondered what kind of man could stand beside a king for years, only to consider betraying him in the end. She thought of Doran's hard eyes and harder voice, a man clearly devoted to protecting his king, frustrated by the constraints of patience and proof. And she thought, more than either of these, of the moment Cade had admitted he did not know why he trusted her, spoken with such quiet honesty that it had settled somewhere deep in her chest and refused to leave. By the time she reached her small house, The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gray. She sat at her table, needle and thread forgotten beside her, staring instead at nothing, replaying every word spoken in that tall stone room. Somewhere within those palace walls, danger was growing closer, and for reasons she could not yet fully explain, Elara found herself hoping desperately that whatever came next would not take Cade from her, before she understood what he had begun to mean to her. Elara nearly dropped the tray of bread she was carrying when she heard her own name spoken through the thin wall of the palace kitchen corridor. She had been asked to wait there while a servant fetched fresh linens for a torn curtain, a small task compared to her previous visits, and she had not expected to overhear anything at all, let alone a conversation clearly not meant for her ears. "The seamstress," a woman's voice said, sharp and cold. "He has called her back 3 times now. 3 times, for a single cloak and a single curtain. Do you take me for a fool?" Elara recognized the second voice as belonging to one of the kitchen servants, hesitant and nervous. "I only know what I am told, my lady. The king requests her presence. That is all anyone here knows." "That is not all," the first voice snapped. "Doran spoke of her being present during a council discussion. A seamstress, present during matters of border security. Does that sound like simple mending to you?" Elara pressed herself closer to the wall, her heart hammering, understanding now that the sharp voice belonged to a noblewoman, someone with enough standing to speak so freely about the king's private choices. She did not recognize the voice, but something in its tone, cold, precise, laced with barely restrained anger, told her this was not a woman accustomed to being overlooked. "Perhaps he simply values her discretion," the servant offered weakly. "Discretion." The word was spat out like something bitter. "I have offered this kingdom my family's alliance for 3 years. I have waited patiently for him to see reason, to see what stability I could bring to his throne. And now, a village seamstress with dirt beneath her fingernails is permitted into rooms I have never once been invited to enter." Elara's stomach twisted painfully. She had not considered, until this moment, that her presence near the king might be seen as a threat by anyone, let alone someone of noble standing with ambitions of her own. She thought of turning away, of pretending she had heard nothing, but her feet remained frozen in place, some instinct keeping her rooted to the spot. "My lady, perhaps it would be wiser to speak with the king directly, rather than—" "I intend to speak with him directly," the noblewoman interrupted. "But I will not be dismissed as easily as some seamstress imagines she can dismiss me. Whatever game she believes she is playing, she will learn very quickly how this palace deals with those who overstep their place. And if she does not learn her place quickly," Priscilla continued, her voice dropping to something colder still, "I will be the one to teach her. Gently, at first. But I am not known for my patience once it wears thin. My lady, surely there is no need for—" "There is every need," Priscilla snapped. "I have spent years positioning my family for this alliance. I will not watch it slip away, because the king has developed a passing curiosity for a woman who smells of thread and poverty. Curiosities fade, alliances endure. I intend to remind him of that fact, one way or another." Footsteps followed, sharp and deliberate, moving away down the corridor. Elara remained frozen for several long moments after the voices faded, her breath shallow, her hands trembling around the edges of the tray she still carried. When the servant who had gone to fetch linens finally returned, Elara forced her expression into something neutral, though her mind raced with everything she had just overheard. "Who was that?" Elara asked carefully, once they were alone again. "The woman speaking before, near the kitchen entrance." The servant's eyes widened slightly, glancing around as though checking for listening ears. "Lady Priscilla," she said quietly, "daughter of one of the oldest noble houses in the kingdom. It has long been assumed she would become the king's mate, once he chose to settle matters of succession." Elara's chest tightened at the word mate, spoken so plainly, as though it were simply a fact of the world, rather than something that made her stomach twist, with an emotion she did not want to examine too closely. "Is it true," Elara asked, "that they are meant for one another?" The servant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Nothing has ever been formally announced, but Lady Priscilla has certainly believed it, for years now, and she is not a woman accustomed to being disappointed." Elara thanked the servant quietly, and made her way toward the tall chamber where Cade waited, her thoughts a tangled mess of worry, and something uncomfortably close to jealousy. an emotion she had no right to feel toward a king she had known for less than a week. When she entered the room, Cade was seated near the fire, a torn curtain draped across his lap, though Elara suspected the tear was minor enough that any servant could have mended it without her presence being required at all. She wondered, not for the first time, whether these small tasks were simply excuses, reasons to keep her near, without either of them needing to say so aloud. "You seem troubled," Cade said, the moment she sat down across from him. Elara considered lying, offering some small excuse about tiredness or the cold. Instead, she found herself speaking honestly, some instinct telling her that honesty was the only currency that mattered in this strange, dangerous world she had stumbled into. "I overheard a conversation," she said carefully. "Lady Priscilla. She is not pleased that I have been called here so often." Cade's expression darkened slightly, though not with surprise. "Priscilla has strong opinions about many things." "She believes she is meant to be your mate," Elara said, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. "Priscilla believes many things about her own future," Cade said, his voice carefully controlled. "Belief does not make something true. But there has been an understanding between your families." Cade set the torn curtain aside, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "There has been an expectation, yes, one I have never confirmed, and one I have grown increasingly certain I do not wish to fulfill." Elara's breath caught at the directness of his words, spoken so plainly despite everything at stake. "Why tell me this?" "Because you asked," he said simply, "and because I am tired of pretending that expectations placed on me by others must always become my choices." The fire crackled softly between them, filling the silence that followed his words. Elara did not know what to say, torn between the relief his words brought and the fear of what such honesty might mean for both of them, given everything already at risk within these palace walls. "I do not say this to place a burden on you," Cade added quietly, as though sensing the weight settling over her. "I say it because you deserve honesty, given how quickly you have been pulled into a world you did not choose." "I did not choose it," Elara agreed softly. "But I do not regret it, either. Even with everything it has brought with it." His gaze softened at her words, something unguarded passing briefly across his features before he composed himself once more. "Most people in your position would regret it deeply. Most people would wish for the quiet, ordinary life they had before. Perhaps I would have said the same, a week ago," Elara admitted. "But a week ago, I had not yet seen what lies beneath the crown you carry. I had not yet understood how heavy it truly is, or how alone you seem to carry it." Cade said nothing for a long moment, simply studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken beneath her skin. "No one has ever spoken to me quite so plainly," he said finally, "least of all about loneliness." "Perhaps no one else has looked closely enough to notice it," Elara replied. "She will not accept being overlooked easily," Elara said finally. "I fear what she might do, my lord." "Cade," he corrected automatically, though his tone carried a weight of concern she had not expected. "And you are right to be cautious. Priscilla's family holds influence I cannot simply dismiss, but that does not mean I will allow her ambitions to dictate choices that belong to me alone." Elara studied him carefully, searching for any sign of doubt, any indication that his words were simply meant to comfort rather than reflect true conviction. She found none. Whatever else Cade might be, guarded, controlled, burdened by a crown too heavy for any single man, he did not appear to be someone who spoke falsely, even in matters as delicate as this. "There is something else," Cade said after a long moment, his voice dropping lower. "Doran believes the attacks along the border may be connected to ambitions closer to home than we first suspected, ambitions that extend beyond simple betrayal for coin or power." Elara's chest tightened with new unease. "You believe Lady Priscilla's family might be involved?" "I believe nothing without proof," Cade said carefully. "But I have learned, in years of ruling this kingdom, that ambition wears many faces, and some of the most dangerous faces are the ones closest to the throne." The weight of his words settled heavily over the room, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the palace beyond the tall windows. Elara realized, with growing clarity, that she had stepped into far more than a simple opportunity for steady work. She had stepped into a web of ambition, suspicion, and danger that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined when the guards first knocked on her door. What will you do? She asked quietly. Watch, Cade said. Wait. And protect those I can, for as long as I am able. His gaze lingered on her as he spoke the final words, and Alara understood, with a small jolt that traveled through her entire body, that she was included among those he intended to protect, whether either of them had spoken the words aloud or not. Before she left, Cade walked her partway through the corridor himself, an unusual gesture that drew more than a few curious glances from passing servants and guards. Neither of them spoke much during the walk, but the silence felt companionable rather than uncomfortable, the kind of quiet shared between two people who had already said the things that mattered most for one evening. At the outer doors, he paused, his gray eyes studying her face carefully, as though committing it to memory. Be watchful, he said quietly. Priscilla is not a woman who makes idle threats. I will be careful, Alara promised. See that you are, he said, and for a moment, something almost tender flickered across his otherwise controlled features. This kingdom has taken enough from me already. I do not intend to lose anything else I have grown to value. The words settled deep in Alara's chest as she stepped out into the cooling evening air, her mind spinning with everything she had learned, and everything left unsaid between them. She left the palace that evening with far more weighing on her mind than she had carried in with her. Questions about Priscilla's ambitions, about Doran's suspicions, about the strange, undeniable pull she felt toward a man everyone else in the kingdom feared. As she walked home beneath a sky darkening toward evening, Alara could not shake the feeling that whatever came next would change everything, for the kingdom, and for her. Alara had not expected to be summoned again so soon, and certainly not for a garment that needed no repair at all. When the guard arrived at her door this time, his message was different from before. The king requests your presence at the palace, permanently, if you are willing. Alara stared at him, certain she had misheard. Permanently? He wishes for you to remain within the palace grounds, to attend to his garments as needed, rather than being summoned back and forth from the village. She stood frozen in her doorway, thoughts racing. A permanent position within the palace was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Financial security beyond anything her small shop could provide. And yet, she understood, with a clarity that made her stomach tighten, that this was not truly about garments at all. She gathered what little she owned into a single bag, locked the door to the small house that had been her entire world for so long, and followed the guard up the hill one final time, though this time, she suspected, she would not be returning home that evening. The palace felt different when she arrived, not as a visitor summoned for a single task, but as someone meant to stay. She was given a small room near the servants' quarters, modest but clean, with a window that looked out over the palace gardens. It was more space than she had ever had to herself, and yet it felt strange, unfamiliar, a life she had not chosen so much as fallen into. Cade found her there that evening, standing in the doorway of her new room, his expression unusually uncertain for a man who commanded armies without hesitation. You did not have to accept, he said. You did not truly give me a choice, my lord, Alara replied, though there was no anger in her words, only honest observation. Cade, he corrected automatically, before sighing and running a hand through his dark hair, an oddly human gesture from a man everyone described as untouchable. You are right. I should have asked more plainly, rather than sending a guard to deliver an order disguised as an invitation. Why did you not ask plainly? Alara pressed gently. He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, as though searching for words that did not come easily. Because I am not accustomed to wanting something for reasons I cannot fully explain, he said finally. It is easier to issue commands than to admit uncertainty. Alara felt something warm settle in her chest at his honesty, though she tried to steady herself against it, aware of how dangerous such feelings could become, given everything already surrounding them. And what is it you want exactly? Cade's gaze finally met hers fully, steady and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him. I want you close, he said simply. I have told myself it is for safety, for convenience, for a dozen practical reasons. But none of those reasons feel entirely honest, not anymore. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have been. Alara did not know how to respond to such directness, torn between the joy such an admission brought and the fear of what it might mean, given Priscilla's ambitions, given the danger already circling the palace like a slow, patient predator. Priscilla will not accept this easily, Elara said quietly. Priscilla's acceptance is not required, Cade said, his voice hardening slightly. Not for decisions that belong to me alone. And Doran, the council? Will they accept a village seamstress living within these walls, given everything happening around your throne? Cade considered the question carefully before answering. Doran trusts my judgment, even when he disagrees with it. The council will grumble, as councils always do. But none of them command my choices, Elara. Not truly. She wanted to believe him entirely, wanted to accept his words without reservation. But years of quiet observation had taught her that even the most well-intentioned promises could crumble beneath the weight of politics and ambition. Still, something in his steady gaze, in the quiet conviction behind his words, made her want to trust him regardless. That first night in her new room, sleep came slowly. Elara lay staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to sounds that were nothing like the quiet of her old house. Distant footsteps in the corridor, the murmur of guards changing shifts, the wind pressing against palace stone that had stood for generations before she was born. She thought of her mother, of what she might have said seeing her daughter carried so suddenly into a world of kings and betrayal. Her mother had always warned her that dreaming too large only led to disappointment. Elara wondered, staring into the darkness, whether she was dreaming too large now, or whether this strange new life was simply the shape her future had always been meant to take. She thought too of Priscilla, of the cold fury in her voice that afternoon in the kitchen corridor, and wondered how many more such conversations were happening throughout the palace, whispered behind closed doors, weighing her worth and her presence against expectations she had never asked to be measured by. It was not a comfortable thought to fall asleep to, but exhaustion eventually claimed her regardless, pulling her under into dreams she would not remember by morning. Over the following days, Elara settled slowly into her new position within the palace, though the transition was far from simple. She was given small tasks at first, mending garments for various members of the household, adjusting hems, repairing torn seams. But increasingly, she found herself summoned to Cade's private chambers, for reasons that had little to do with actual sewing at all. Sometimes they spoke of small things, memories of her mother, stories from his childhood before the crown had settled so heavily on his shoulders. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, her needle moving steadily through fabric, while he reviewed reports and correspondence nearby. And sometimes, in quieter moments, he spoke of the kingdom's troubles more openly than she suspected he spoke with anyone else. The growing suspicion surrounding Lord Callum, the persistent ambitions of Priscilla's family, the exhausting weight of ruling a kingdom that seemed determined to test him at every turn. Elara began to understand, more clearly with each passing day, that the fearsome reputation surrounding Cade had been built largely on misunderstanding. He was not cruel, he was careful, guarded by necessity rather than nature, shaped by years of watching those closest to him reveal ambitions that had little to do with genuine loyalty. Beneath that careful exterior lay a man who valued honesty deeply, who carried the weight of his people's survival with a seriousness that left little room for softness, except, it seemed, in the moments he chose to share with her. She learned, too, small details that the village stories had never captured. That he preferred quiet mornings to loud councils, that he had lost his father young, and had been forced into rule before he felt ready for its weight, that he still remembered the names of soldiers who had died under his command years before, carrying each loss privately, rather than burying it beneath the armor of command. These were not the details of a monster. They were the details of a man who had been alone for far too long, surrounded by ambition and expectation, rather than genuine companionship. The other servants noticed the change in her standing quickly, some offering cautious warmth, others regarding her with the same suspicion Doran had shown during their first meeting. She did not blame them. She understood how strange her presence must appear. A village seamstress suddenly given rooms within the palace, summoned to private chambers far more often than any simple mending required. She kept her head down during those early days, focusing on her work, learning the rhythms of palace life, and trying not to dwell too long on the whispers that inevitably followed wherever she walked. One evening, as autumn winds began to sharpen outside the palace windows, Elara found him standing alone, near the same tall windows where she had first seen him, staring out at nothing in particular, his shoulders carrying visible tension. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting aside the garment she had been mending. "Doran has confirmed movement near the northern border," Cade said quietly. Enemy forces. Gathering in numbers larger than we anticipated. Whatever information has been leaking from within these walls, it has given our enemies confidence they should not possess. Ilara moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cold air seeping through the window glass. What will you do? Prepare, he said simply, and hope that whoever betrays us reveals themselves before more lives are lost. You suspect it is truly someone close to the throne, Ilara said quietly, not merely a soldier passing information carelessly. I suspect many things, Cade said, his voice tightening with barely restrained frustration. Suspicion without proof accomplishes nothing, except perhaps driving the traitor deeper into hiding. Ilara reached out, hesitating only briefly, before resting a hand gently against his arm, an act of comfort she had not planned but which felt entirely natural in the moment. Cade's gaze dropped to her hand, then rose to meet her eyes, something unguarded and grateful passing across his features. You do not need to carry all of this alone, Ilara said softly. I have carried it alone for a very long time, Cade admitted. I am not entirely certain I remember how to do otherwise. Then perhaps, Ilara said gently, it is time to learn. Cade's hand rose to cover hers, where it rested against his arm, his fingers warm and steady, holding her touch in place rather than dismissing it. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the weight of unspoken feeling settling comfortably between them, despite the danger gathering just beyond the palace walls. Thank you, he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. For what? For staying, he said simply, even knowing everything you now know about the danger surrounding this throne. Ilara smiled softly, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. I did not truly have anywhere else I wished to be. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious, before duty inevitably pulled Cade's attention back toward the reports waiting on his desk, back toward the growing threats gathering at the edges of his kingdom. Ilara stepped back quietly, allowing him the space to return to his responsibilities, though she lingered near the doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching him settle behind his desk, watching the tension return slowly to his shoulders as duty reclaimed him. Get some rest, he said, without looking up from the papers before him, though there was warmth threaded through the simple instruction. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles. Tonight, at least, we are still standing. Ilara smiled faintly at the small comfort in his words, and made her way back toward her own room, her thoughts a quiet tangle of fear and something warmer, something she did not yet have the courage to name fully, even to herself. But something had shifted between them in that quiet exchange, something neither of them spoke aloud, though both understood it clearly enough. Whatever came next, storm or betrayal or battle, they would face it no longer as king and seamstress, but as two people who had begun, slowly and carefully, to matter deeply to one another. The summons came sharp and urgent, pulling Ilara from her small room before she had even finished dressing. Lady Priscilla wished to speak with her directly, in the receiving hall, before the entire morning court. Ilara's hands trembled as she smoothed her simple dress, aware that whatever was about to happen, it would not be gentle. She had known this confrontation was coming since the day she overheard Priscilla's cold fury echoing through the kitchen corridor. She had simply hoped for more time to prepare. On her way through the corridors, she passed servants who offered quick, sympathetic glances, none of them daring to speak openly, but their expressions telling her enough. Word of the coming confrontation had clearly spread through the palace already, whispered from kitchen to hallway to servants' quarters, faster than any official announcement could have traveled. By the time she reached the receiving hall, she understood that whatever happened within its walls would not remain a private matter for long. The receiving hall was already filled with nobles and courtiers when she arrived, their conversations quieting into curious murmurs as she entered. Priscilla stood near the center of the room, dressed in deep crimson, her dark hair pinned elegantly, her expression carrying the composed cruelty of someone accustomed to winning every battle she chose to fight. Ah, the seamstress, Priscilla said, her voice carrying easily across the hall. How kind of you to join us. Ilara offered a small, careful bow, unwilling to give Priscilla any excuse to accuse her of disrespect in front of so many witnesses. My lady. I understand you have taken up permanent residence within the palace, Priscilla continued, circling slowly as she spoke, forcing Ilara to turn in place to keep her within sight. Quite the honor. for someone of your background. The king requested my services, Alara said carefully. I have simply agreed to provide them. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the gathered nobles, though whether it was directed at Alara or at Priscilla's obvious frustration, Alara could not immediately tell. Services, Priscilla repeated, her tone sharpening. An interesting choice of word, given how frequently you seem to be summoned, for reasons that have very little to do with actual needlework. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed, aware that any visible reaction would only fuel whatever narrative Priscilla intended to construct in front of the watching court. I mend what I am asked to mend, my lady, nothing more. And yet you were present during council discussions regarding border security, Priscilla pressed. Tell me, seamstress, what particular skill qualifies you to sit among generals and kings while matters of war are discussed? The hall had gone fully silent now, every eye fixed on the exchange unfolding at its center. Alara's mind raced, searching for words that would not further inflame the situation, aware that Priscilla had clearly planned this confrontation carefully, choosing a public setting where humiliation would carry the greatest weight. I was present because the king requested it, Alara said finally, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. I do not claim any qualification beyond his trust. His trust, Priscilla echoed, something dangerous flickering across her composed features. How swiftly trust seems to have grown, for a woman he met barely a fortnight ago. Before Alara could respond, a new voice cut sharply through the tension filling the hall. Enough. Every head turned toward the entrance, where Cade stood, his expression carrying a coldness Alara had not seen directed at anyone since her very first meeting with him. The temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees at his arrival, courtiers straightening, conversations dying instantly beneath the weight of his presence. My lord, Priscilla began, her composed cruelty shifting quickly into something more careful. I heard exactly what you were doing, Cade said, crossing the hall with measured, deliberate steps. Humiliating a guest within my household, in front of my entire court, for the crime of accepting tasks I myself assigned to her. Your household, Priscilla said, her voice tightening. A household my family has long expected to join formally, through proper alliance, rather than whatever arrangement this seamstress imagines she has secured. Cade stopped directly beside Alara, close enough that his presence felt like a physical shield against the hostility still radiating from Priscilla's carefully composed features. No arrangement has ever been formally agreed between our families, Priscilla. Expectation is not agreement. It never has been. The words landed heavily across the silent hall, and Alara watched something crack briefly across Priscilla's composure, quickly masked but not quickly enough to hide entirely from those watching closely. You forget yourself, Priscilla, Cade continued, his voice quieter now, though it carried further in the silence than any shout could have. I have honored your family with courtesy for years, out of respect for the alliance your father built with mine, long before either of us wore a crown or a title. That courtesy does not extend to allowing you to humiliate someone under my protection, in my own hall, before witnesses gathered to watch the spectacle. Protection, Priscilla repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. Is that truly what this is, my lord? Or have you simply grown blind to how this looks? A king, fawning over a seamstress, while an entire noble house waits patiently for the future it was promised. No future was ever promised, Cade said firmly. Only hoped for, by your family and by mine. Hope is not obligation, Priscilla, however deeply you have chosen to believe otherwise. Years of understanding between our houses mean nothing to you, Priscilla said, her voice lower now, though no less sharp. They mean a great deal to me, Cade said, which is precisely why I have never confirmed an arrangement I do not intend to honor. I will not insult you further by pretending otherwise in front of this court. Priscilla's jaw tightened visibly, her eyes flicking briefly toward Alara, with a hatred so raw it made Alara's breath catch in her throat. And this is your choice instead? A seamstress from the lower village? My choices are my own, Cade said, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for further argument. As they always have been, regardless of expectations placed upon me by others. The hall remained silent for a long, uncomfortable moment, courtiers exchanging careful glances, unwilling to be caught reacting too visibly to whatever was unfolding before them. Priscilla straightened slowly, gathering the remains of her composure with visible effort. This is not finished, she said quietly, though the words carried clearly enough in the silence. I will not simply step aside because you have grown fond of a passing curiosity. That is your choice to make, Cade said evenly. But I would advise caution, Priscilla. Threats made publicly are threats that can be answered publicly as well. Something in his tone carried enough weight that Priscilla's expression flickered with something close to genuine fear, quickly buried beneath practiced composure. She offered a stiff, shallow bow and turned sharply, sweeping from the hall with her attendants trailing quickly behind her, leaving a wake of hushed whispers in her departure. The moment she disappeared through the far doors, the tension in the hall broke slightly, conversations resuming in careful, quiet murmurs. Cade turned to Alara, his expression softening from the cold authority he had shown Priscilla into something gentler, though concern still lingered clearly in his gray eyes. "Are you unharmed?" he asked quietly. "I am unharmed," Alara said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Thank you, my lord. Cade." He offered a small, tired smile at her correction, though the weight of the confrontation had not fully left his shoulders. "I should not have allowed this to happen. I should have anticipated Priscilla's response more carefully. You could not have known she would confront me so publicly," Alara said. "I should have known," Cade said quietly. "I know her ambitions well enough. I simply hoped, foolishly, that she would accept reality with more grace than this." Alara studied him carefully, noticing the tension still visible in his jaw, the careful control he maintained even now, moments after publicly declaring choices that would ripple through the entire court by nightfall. "You have made your position clear," she said. "That could not have been easy, given everything your families have expected for years." "It was easier than I expected," Cade admitted. "Far easier than continuing to pretend an arrangement I never truly wanted." The words settled warmly in Alara's chest, despite the lingering fear from Priscilla's confrontation, despite the certainty that this public declaration would only sharpen whatever danger already surrounded them both. She understood, with growing clarity, that whatever came next, whatever schemes Priscilla's wounded pride might construct in retaliation, she and Cade had crossed a threshold together that could not easily be undone. Later that evening, Alara sat alone in her small room, replaying the confrontation over and over in her mind. She thought of the murmurs that had followed her through the corridors afterward, some courtiers offering careful nods of respect, others watching her with open suspicion, as though her presence alone had somehow upset a natural order they had long taken for granted. She understood, sitting there in the quiet, that her life within the palace had changed irreversibly that morning. There would be no returning to the cautious anonymity she had enjoyed during her first days of service. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she opened the door to find Cade standing in the corridor, his expression carrying a tiredness she had not seen from him before, the weight of the day's confrontation clearly settling heavily across his shoulders. "I wanted to make certain you were truly well," he said quietly. Priscilla's words were cruel, and I know cruelty like that lingers long after the moment has passed. "I am well," Alara said, stepping aside to let him enter, though the small room barely seemed to hold his presence comfortably. "Though I confess, I do not think this is finished," as she said herself. "No," Cade agreed grimly. "I do not believe it is finished either. Priscilla does not accept defeat gracefully, and her family holds influence that extends well beyond her own ambitions." "Then we should be careful," Alara said. "For both our sakes." Cade nodded slowly, though something in his gray eyes carried a quiet determination that steadied her nerves, despite the danger clearly gathering around them. "We will be careful," he said, "but I will not allow fear of her retaliation to undo what I declared today. Whatever comes next, I do not regret the choice I made in that hall." As they walked together from the now quieting hall earlier, and now standing together in the quiet of her small room, Alara could not shake the feeling that Priscilla's parting words had carried more than simple wounded pride. There had been calculation beneath her anger, the quiet promise of someone already planning her next move, rather than accepting defeat. Alara glanced toward the window, a chill settling over her despite the warmth of Cade's presence beside her, some instinct warning her that the true danger had only just begun to stir. The scream came from the corridor outside the great hall, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet evening air like a blade. Alara dropped the folded linens she carried, her heart lurching as chaos erupted around her, guards shouting, footsteps pounding against stone, the unmistakable clash of metal against metal echoing from somewhere close. She did not think. She simply ran toward the sound, toward the hall where she knew Cade had been meeting with his counsel only moments before, ignoring every instinct that told her to run the other way instead. The scene that greeted her was worse than she imagined. 2 guards lay wounded near the entrance, one clutching a bleeding arm, the other struggling to rise from the floor. Further inside, Cade stood locked in combat with a masked figure, blades flashing in the flickering torchlight, both fighters moving with a speed that made Alara's breath catch painfully in her throat. She understood, watching them move, that this was no ordinary assassin. The attacker fought with precision, with knowledge of Cade's fighting style that suggested intimate familiarity, the kind of familiarity only someone within the palace itself could possess. For a moment, Alara could do nothing but watch, frozen by the speed and violence of the fight unfolding before her. She had seen Cade calm and controlled during council meetings, gentle during quiet evenings spent mending garments beside him, but she had never seen this side of him, the warrior beneath the crown, moving with a lethal grace that spoke of years spent surviving exactly this kind of danger. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, watching him fight for his life, against an enemy who clearly knew his every weakness, she felt only a desperate, burning need to help him survive. Cade's blade caught the attacker's shoulder, drawing a sharp cry of pain, but the masked figure recovered quickly, driving forward with renewed ferocity. Alara watched in horror as Cade stumbled slightly against an overturned chair, his balance faltering for just a moment, just long enough for the attacker to raise a blade meant to end everything. Alara did not remember deciding to move. She simply found herself grabbing a heavy iron candlestick from a nearby table and hurling it with all the strength she possessed, striking the attacker's arm at the exact moment the blade should have found its mark. The candlestick struck true, throwing off the attacker's aim just enough that the blade grazed harmlessly across Cade's shoulder instead of finding his heart. The attacker turned toward her, momentarily distracted, and Cade seized the opening without hesitation, driving his own blade forward with lethal precision. The masked figure crumpled to the floor, and the hall fell suddenly, terribly silent, broken only by the ragged sound of everyone's breathing. Guards flooded the room moments later, drawn by the earlier commotion, surrounding the fallen attacker and securing the hall with practiced efficiency. Cade stood breathing heavily, his shoulder bleeding through torn fabric, his gray eyes finding Alara across the chaos, with an intensity that made her knees weaken beneath her. "You should not have come here," he said, crossing the distance between them in quick strides. "I could not simply stay away," Alara said, her voice shaking with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "Not when I heard what was happening." Cade's hand rose to cup her face gently, his fingers trembling slightly despite the steadiness he usually carried. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Alara replied. "And yet here we both are." Doran arrived moments later, his expression thunderous as he surveyed the scene, the fallen attacker, the wounded guards, Cade's bleeding shoulder. "Someone knew exactly when to strike," he said grimly. "Someone knew you would be walking through that corridor alone, without your usual guard beside you." "Someone within these walls," Cade said quietly, his gaze hardening despite the pain visible in his tightened jaw. Doran knelt beside the fallen attacker, carefully removing the mask that had concealed the man's identity. Alara did not recognize the face revealed beneath, though Doran's expression darkened further at the sight of it. "One of Callum's personal guard," Doran said grimly. "This confirms what we have suspected for weeks now." "Callum's own guard," Cade repeated quietly, as though testing the weight of the words. "Not Callum himself, striking directly. He is careful enough to keep his own hands clean, even now. Careful, or arrogant enough to believe he will never be caught," Doran said grimly. "Either way, this is no longer suspicion, Cade. This is proof enough to act, even if it does not yet point directly at Callum's own blade. It is proof that his guard acted alone, or on his own initiative," Cade said, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "Callum will simply claim the man acted without orders, that his loyalty was misused by someone else entirely. Without more, we cannot move against him directly, not without risking exactly the chaos he hopes to provoke." Doran's expression darkened further, though he did not argue the point, clearly understanding the political weight behind Cade's caution, even as every instinct in him screamed for immediate action. "Then we find more," he said simply. "Tonight's failure will only make him bolder, believing perhaps that we still do not see him clearly enough." Cade's jaw tightened visibly, though he said nothing immediately. His attention still divided between the confirmation of betrayal and the wound bleeding steadily through his shoulder. Elara moved quickly, tearing a strip of fabric from her own sleeve to press firmly against the injury, ignoring his protests as she worked. "You need proper attention," she said firmly, "not stubborn pride." Despite the tension filling the room, something almost like amusement flickered across Cade's pained expression. "You give orders now, seamstress." "When necessary," Elara replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she worked, the reality of how close she had come to losing him settling heavily over her all at once. Doran ordered the hall cleared, guards moving the fallen attacker's body away, servants summoned to tend properly to Cade's wound. Through it all, Elara remained close, refusing to leave his side despite several suggestions that she return to her own quarters for safety. Later, once a healer had properly cleaned and bound the wound across his shoulder, Cade sat quietly in his private chambers, Elara seated beside him, her hands still faintly trembling from the evening's events. "You saved my life tonight," Cade said quietly, breaking the long silence that had settled between them. "I did what anyone would have done," Elara said, though her voice carried little conviction behind the modest words. "No," Cade said firmly, turning to face her fully, despite the pain the movement clearly caused. "Not anyone would have run toward danger, rather than away from it. Not anyone would have thrown themselves so recklessly into a fight that was not theirs to join. It became mine, the moment I understood you were in danger," Elara said softly. Cade studied her carefully, something raw and unguarded passing openly across his features, stripped now of the careful control he usually maintained so rigidly. "I have faced death many times, Elara. I have never once feared it the way I feared it tonight, watching that blade come toward me, and thinking only of how much I still wished to say to you, how much time I feared I would lose before ever saying it." Elara's breath caught at the rawness in his voice, at words spoken so plainly, despite everything still uncertain around them. "Cade, let me finish," he said gently, reaching for her hand, despite the pain still radiating from his wounded shoulder. "I have spent years building walls around myself, convinced that trust was a luxury I could not afford, that closeness only ever led to betrayal and loss. And then you arrived, mending torn fabric with more care than most people show toward the things that truly matter, and somehow, without my permission, you found your way past every wall I had built. I did not intend to find my way anywhere," Elara said softly, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "I only intended to mend a cloak." A tired, genuine smile crossed Cade's features, despite the exhaustion and pain still evident in his posture. "And instead, you mended something far more broken than fabric ever could be." The words settled deeply into Elara's chest, warm and overwhelming despite the danger still surrounding them both, despite the confirmation of betrayal now hanging heavily over the palace, despite Priscilla's lingering threats, and Lord Callum's apparent involvement in tonight's near disaster. She understood, sitting quietly beside him in the dim candlelight, that whatever came next, they would face it together now, bound by something far stronger than the careful distance they had maintained during their first uncertain meetings. "We need to find proof against Callum," Elara said finally, practical concerns reasserting themselves despite the emotion still thick in the air between them, "before he attempts something even more dangerous." "Doran is already investigating," Cade said, his voice steadying, as duty reclaimed its familiar place within him. "But you are right. We cannot wait indefinitely for proof to simply present itself. Callum has grown bold enough to strike within these very walls. He will not hesitate to strike again, given the opportunity." Elara nodded slowly, fear and determination mingling together within her chest. She thought of the fallen guard, the mask that had concealed his identity until Doran removed it, the confirmation that betrayal had grown roots deep enough within the palace to send a man to die attempting murder rather than simply whisper secrets from the shadows. It was one thing to suspect danger circling somewhere beyond the palace walls. It was another entirely to have watched it arrive, blade drawn, in a corridor she herself had walked through only moments before. "I want to help," she said quietly, surprising herself with the conviction behind the words. "Not simply wait here, mending garments while you and Doran search for proof." Cade studied her carefully, concern, and something like reluctant admiration passing across his tired features. This is dangerous work, Ilara. More dangerous than anything you have faced so far. I already faced a blade meant for your heart tonight, Ilara said. I do not think danger is something I can avoid simply by staying quietly in my room. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words carefully, before finally nodding, though reluctance remained visible in the set of his shoulders. Then we face it together, he said, whatever comes next. Whatever came next, she understood clearly now that she was no longer simply a bystander, pulled unwillingly into palace politics. She had chosen, in the moment she threw that candlestick without hesitation, to stand firmly beside Cade, against whatever danger still gathered in the shadows surrounding his throne. Rain hammered against the palace windows, as Ilara searched through stacks of correspondence Doran had gathered from Lord Callum's private study. Papers seized under the careful justification that his guard's betrayal warranted at least a thorough review of his affairs. Cade sat across the table, his shoulders still bandaged beneath his shirt, his eyes tired but sharp as he sorted through his own stack of letters. Nothing, he muttered, after another hour of careful reading. Nothing but ordinary correspondence, requests for grain shipments, complaints about tax collection. If Callum is truly behind this, he has been careful enough to leave no written trail. The work was tedious, far removed from the danger and drama of the previous evening, and yet Ilara understood its importance clearly enough. Somewhere within these ordinary-looking papers lay the proof that could finally expose Lord Callum's betrayal, or clear his name entirely if the guard truly had acted alone. She forced herself to read each letter carefully, searching for anything that felt out of place, any phrase that carried more weight than its surface meaning suggested. Doran had warned them both that Callum was clever, careful enough to have survived years of court politics without ever drawing serious suspicion until recently. If proof existed, it would not be obvious. It would be hidden carefully within language that appeared, at first glance, entirely innocent. Ilara continued scanning her own stack, her eyes growing heavy with fatigue, when a particular letter caught her attention, tucked between two unremarkable requests for supplies. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the language careful and coded, referencing shipments and deliveries that made little sense given the context surrounding them. Cade, she said quietly, sliding the letter across the table toward him. This one seems strange. He read it carefully, his expression sharpening as he studied the careful, coded language. This is not about grain shipments, he said slowly. This is about troop movements, disguised as trade correspondence. Ilara's pulse quickened. You believe this confirms Callum's involvement? I believe it confirms someone within his household has been communicating with our enemies, Cade said, his voice tight with restrained anger. Whether Callum himself wrote this, or someone acting under his authority, remains to be seen. But this is more than we have found in weeks of searching. He rose immediately, calling for Doran, and within moments, the general arrived, his expression grim, as he examined the letter Ilara had discovered. This matches patterns we intercepted from enemy correspondence last month, Doran said, comparing the coded phrases carefully. The same cipher, the same careful disguising of troop movements as trade goods. Enough to move against Callum directly? Cade asked. Enough to bring him before council for formal questioning, Doran said carefully. Whether it proves sufficient for full conviction depends on how skillfully he defends himself and how many allies remain willing to protect him, despite growing evidence. Cade's jaw tightened, weighing the political weight of the decision before him. Then we move carefully. I will not give him room to claim persecution without proper cause, not when his allies within the council remain numerous enough to cause real difficulty. How long will preparations take? Cade asked. A day, perhaps two, Doran said. I want every detail confirmed before we bring this before council. Callum will fight this with every resource available to him, and I do not intend to give him any opening to escape accountability through some careless oversight on our part. Take the time you need, Cade said, but move quickly enough that he does not sense our suspicion growing and attempt to flee or destroy further evidence before we are ready. Doran nodded firmly and gathered the letter carefully, along with several other documents Cade indicated should be preserved as evidence. I will have guards watching his household discreetly, in case he grows nervous enough to act rashly. Good, Cade said. And Doran, thank you for your patience through all of this. I know you wished to move faster, weeks ago. Patience is easier when it finally bears fruit, Doran said, allowing himself a small, tired smile, before departing the room, leaving Cade and Alara alone once more, amid the scattered papers. As Doran departed to begin preparations for the formal questioning, Cade turned back toward Alara, something warm passing across his tired features, despite the seriousness of the discovery. "You found what weeks of searching could not," he said quietly. "I am not certain how to properly thank you for that." "You do not need to thank me," Alara said, though warmth spread through her chest at his obvious gratitude. "I only wish to see this danger ended, for your sake, as much as the kingdom's." Cade moved closer, reaching for her hand across the table, scattered with letters and papers. "There is something I have wanted to say for some time now," he said quietly, though circumstances have never seemed to allow the proper moment. Ilara's breath caught, uncertain what to expect, though something in his gentle tone eased whatever anxiety had begun gathering in her chest. "What is it?" "When I first saw you, mending that torn cloak with such careful attention, I told myself my interest was simply curiosity," Cade began, his voice quieter than she had heard it before, stripped of the careful authority he usually carried. "I told myself the same thing during our second meeting, and our third. I have told myself a great many convenient explanations over these past weeks, each one growing less believable than the last." "And now?" Ilara asked softly. "Now I no longer wish to pretend," Cade said, his gray eyes holding hers steadily despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. "I have grown to care for you deeply, Ilara, not simply as someone whose skill I value, or whose courage saved my life. I care for you in ways I have not allowed myself to feel for anyone in a very long time." Ilara's heart pounded fiercely against her ribs, joy and disbelief tangling together within her chest. "I feel the same," she admitted quietly. "I have felt it growing since that very first afternoon, though I told myself it was foolish to hope for anything beyond simple service to a king so far above my station." "You are not beneath anything," Cade said firmly, his hand tightening gently around hers. "Titles and stations mean very little, Ilara, compared to the kind of courage and honesty you have shown me since the moment we met. If anything, I have felt beneath you these past weeks, unworthy of the steadiness you carry so effortlessly through danger that would break lesser people entirely." Tears gathered unexpectedly at the corners of Ilara's eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity behind his words. What does this mean? Given everything still surrounding us, Priscilla's ambitions, Callum's betrayal, the council's expectations, it means I no longer intend to let those things dictate my choices, Cade said firmly. I have spent my entire reign allowing expectation and obligation to shape decisions that should have belonged to me alone. I am done allowing that, Ilara. Starting now. He raised her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so tender it stole the breath from her lungs entirely. I cannot promise the road ahead will be easy, he continued quietly. Priscilla will not accept this gracefully, and Callum's allies will use whatever weapon they can find against us both, once his betrayal becomes fully known. But I can promise you this, Ilara. Whatever comes, I do not intend to face it without you standing beside me. Then you will not have to, Ilara said softly, her voice steady, despite the tears still gathered in her eyes. I do not frighten easily anymore, not after everything these past weeks have shown me. A genuine smile spread across Cade's face, warm and unguarded, in a way Ilara suspected very few people within the kingdom had ever been fortunate enough to witness. No, he agreed softly. I do not believe you do. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, though within the quiet room, surrounded by scattered papers holding proof of betrayal and danger, still gathering at the edges of the kingdom, something entirely different had taken root between them, fragile perhaps, but undeniably real. Ilara understood, sitting quietly beside Cade as evening deepened into night, that whatever trials still awaited them, whatever schemes Priscilla or Callum's allies might yet construct, she would face them all gladly, so long as it meant standing beside the man who had somehow, despite every wall he built to protect himself, allowed her close enough to matter. Later, as she prepared to return to her own room for the night, Cade walked her through the quiet corridors himself, their hands intertwined despite the late hour, and the occasional guard who passed with carefully neutral expressions. At her door, he paused, his gray eyes searching her face with quiet tenderness. Sleep well, he said softly. Tomorrow, we bring Callum before council. Whatever happens, know that I do not regret a single moment of these past weeks, danger and difficulty included. Nor do I, Elara replied, rising slightly to press a gentle kiss against his cheek, before stepping back through her doorway. Good night, Cade. Good night, Elara, he said softly, and something in the quiet warmth of his voice lingered with her, long after the door closed between them. Once alone, Elara sat by her small window, watching rain trace slow paths down the glass, her thoughts full of everything the evening had brought. She thought of the letter she had found, the careful cipher hidden within ordinary words, and wondered how many other secrets lay buried throughout the palace, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. She thought too of Cade's confession, spoken so plainly after weeks of careful distance, and felt a warmth settle over her that no amount of rain or danger could fully diminish. She knew Priscilla would not simply accept defeat. She knew Callum's allies would fight fiercely to protect him, once formal questioning began. But sitting there in the quiet of her small room, turning over every word Cade had spoken, Elara found herself unafraid in a way she had not expected. Whatever storms still gathered ahead, she no longer faced them as a stranger pulled unwillingly into palace politics. She faced them now as someone chosen, someone valued, someone who mattered deeply to the man carrying the weight of an entire kingdom upon his shoulders. Sleep found her eventually, carrying her gently into rest, despite the uncertainty still waiting for them both in the days ahead. Word of the coming trial had spread quickly through the palace in the days since Callum's letter had been uncovered, and Elara had felt the weight of curious stares following her through every corridor since. Some servants offered quiet nods of respect, grateful perhaps that her discovery might finally bring an end to the danger that had haunted the palace for months. Others regarded her with open wariness, uncertain what to make of a seamstress who had somehow found herself at the very center of matters that determined the fate of noble houses. Elara had barely slept the night before, her mind turning over every possible outcome, every way Callum might twist the evidence against him into something less damning than it truly was. She knew men skilled in court politics could often talk their way free of accusations that seemed, on the surface, entirely conclusive. She feared, more than anything, that his composure and years of practiced diplomacy might prove more persuasive to the council than a single letter and a frightened guard's testimony. The council chamber had never felt so crowded, nor so tense, as it did the morning Lord Callum was summoned before the assembled nobles to answer for the letter Elara had discovered. Elara stood near the back of the room, close enough to see clearly, far enough to remain out of the direct focus of the proceedings, though she felt eyes turning toward her regardless, as whispers spread about her role in uncovering the evidence. Callum entered with practiced composure, a tall man with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes that swept the room before settling on Cade with careful neutrality. He bowed formally, though the gesture carried none of the warmth Elara imagined true loyalty should hold. "My lord," Callum said smoothly, "I understand serious accusations have been raised against me. I welcome the opportunity to clear my name before this council." "Then let us begin," Cade said, his voice carrying the same cold authority Elara had witnessed during his confrontation with Priscilla weeks before. He gestured for Doran to present the evidence, and the general stepped forward, reading the coded letter aloud, explaining carefully how its cipher matched patterns intercepted from enemy correspondence. Callum listened with careful, composed patience, and when Doran finished, he offered a small, practiced smile. "I confess I do not recognize this letter, General. Perhaps you might explain how it came to be found among my private correspondence, given that I did not write it myself." "It was found within papers seized from your study," Doran said, "following the confirmed involvement of your personal guard in an assassination attempt against the king. An attempt I have already expressed deep regret over," Callum said smoothly. "The man acted entirely without my knowledge or authorization. I have long suspected disloyalty within my household, though I confess I did not imagine it extended to attempted murder." Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles, several exchanging glances that suggested at least some sympathy toward Callum's careful defense. Elara watched anxiously, aware that his composure and practiced words carried real weight among a council uncertain whether to believe evidence built primarily on circumstance. She recognized several faces among the nobles who had long counted Callum among their closest allies, men who owed him favors accumulated over years of careful political maneuvering. She understood, watching their uncertain expressions, that evidence alone might not be enough to overcome years of cultivated loyalty and obligation. Cade seemed to sense the same uncertainty rippling through the chamber, his jaw tightening as he studied the room carefully, before turning his attention back toward Callum. "And this letter," Cade said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs immediately. "You claim complete ignorance of its contents, despite it being found among your own private papers?" "I claim exactly that," Callum said, meeting Cade's gaze steadily. "My household is large, my lord. Not every letter that passes through my study bears my direct knowledge or authorship. If someone within my staff has been communicating with our enemies, I am as much a victim of that betrayal as this kingdom itself." The chamber fell into uncertain murmuring once more, and Alara felt her stomach twist with growing anxiety. Callum's defense was clever, shifting blame toward unnamed staff, while positioning himself as another casualty of the very betrayal he stood accused of orchestrating. Doran stepped forward again, his expression hardening. "We have additional evidence," he said. "Testimony from a guard within your household, willing to confirm direct orders given by you personally regarding communication with enemy forces." Callum's composure flickered for the first time, something sharp and dangerous passing briefly across his calculating features, before he schooled his expression back into careful neutrality. "I would very much like to hear this testimony myself," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "You shall," Doran said, gesturing toward the chamber's side entrance, where a nervous young guard was escorted forward, flanked carefully by 2 soldiers. Alara recognized him as one of the men who had stood watch outside Callum's private study during the search, a detail she had not thought significant until this exact moment. The young guard, clearly frightened but resolute, described in halting detail how he had personally delivered coded messages between Callum's study and contacts along the northern border, believing initially that the correspondence concerned legitimate trade matters, until growing suspicious of the careful secrecy surrounding each delivery. "Why come forward now?" Cade asked the guard directly, his voice gentler than it had been with Callum, though no less serious. "Because good men died in that ambush along the river, my lord," the guard said, his voice trembling slightly. "And because I could no longer live with the weight of what my silence might have helped cause." Callum's expression had grown considerably paler by the time the guard finished speaking, his careful composure cracking visibly beneath the weight of direct testimony he could not easily dismiss as circumstantial evidence alone. "This man clearly seeks favor by inventing accusations," Callum said, though his voice carried far less conviction than his earlier defense. "I have served this council loyally for over a decade. Surely that service counts for something against the word of a single frightened guard." "Loyalty is measured by actions, Callum," Cade said coldly, "not simply by years of service performed while ambition quietly grew beneath the surface. This council has heard sufficient evidence to warrant formal charges of treason against you." The chamber erupted into murmurs and exclamations, some nobles rising from their seats in obvious shock, others exchanging grim, knowing glances that suggested they had long suspected exactly this outcome. Callum's careful mask finally shattered entirely, fury and desperation replacing his earlier composure. "You would believe the word of a frightened servant over years of loyal service?" Callum demanded, his voice rising sharply. "This is nothing more than a convenient excuse to remove anyone who dares question your growing attachment to a common seamstress, rather than honoring proper alliances this kingdom has long depended upon." Cade's expression turned to ice at the accusation, though his voice remained controlled despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "This council will decide based on evidence, Callum, not based on your desperate attempts to shift blame onto matters entirely unrelated to your betrayal." Guards moved forward at Cade's signal, flanking Callum on either side, as the full weight of formal arrest settled visibly over him. He struggled briefly against their grip, his earlier composure entirely abandoned. "This is not finished," he snarled, echoing words disturbingly similar to Priscilla's own parting threat weeks before. "You will regret dismissing my family's loyalty so carelessly. Your family's loyalty ended the moment you chose treason over honor," Cade said coldly, watching without flinching as guards escorted Callum from the chamber, his protests fading gradually into the corridor beyond. The chamber remained tense long after Callum's departure, nobles whispering urgently among themselves, clearly shaken by the swift and decisive resolution of accusations that had simmered quietly for weeks. Cade addressed the council briefly, outlining the formal process that would follow, ensuring proper legal proceedings would determine Callum's ultimate fate, rather than allowing rumor or panic to dictate outcomes. Once the council finally dispersed, Ilara found herself standing quietly beside Cade in the emptying chamber, exhaustion and relief mingling heavily within her chest. "It is done," Cade said quietly, though something in his tone suggested the victory felt hollow rather than triumphant. "You do not seem relieved," Ilara observed carefully. "I trusted him for years," Cade admitted, his voice carrying genuine weariness. "Watching him abandon every pretense of loyalty so completely, it is difficult to feel triumphant, even knowing justice was served." Ilara reached for his hand gently, offering quiet comfort rather than empty words. "Betrayal from someone trusted deeply always cuts more sharply than betrayal from a stranger," she said softly. "It does not make you foolish for having trusted him. It simply makes his betrayal all the more, his own failing, not yours." Cade's fingers tightened gently around hers, gratitude evident in the small gesture. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For finding that letter, for standing here through all of this. I do not think I could have faced today so steadily without you beside me." "You would have faced it regardless," Ilara said. "I simply feel fortunate to stand beside you while you do." Despite the heaviness still lingering after the day's events, something steady and warm passed between them, a quiet reminder that whatever storm still remained ahead, Priscilla's simmering resentment, the formal proceedings still required to determine Callum's fate, they would face each remaining challenge together, bound now by trust, forged through danger and honesty, rather than simple circumstance. That evening, as the palace slowly settled back into its usual rhythms, despite the day's dramatic events, Ilara walked alone through the quiet gardens, needing air and space to fully absorb everything that had happened. She thought of the young guard who had come forward, despite obvious fear, of the good men lost along the river whose deaths had finally been given proper cause and consequence. She thought too of Callum's final words, the threat that had echoed so uncomfortably like Priscilla's own warning weeks before, and wondered how many more enemies still waited quietly in the shadows, unwilling to accept the changes taking root within the palace. Cade found her there eventually, his footsteps quiet against the garden path, his expression softer now than it had been within the tense confines of the council chamber. "I thought I might find you here," he said, settling beside her on a stone bench worn smooth by years of quiet evenings. "I needed to think," Ilara admitted. "Today felt like an ending, and yet somehow I do not think it truly was." "No," Cade agreed quietly. "I suspect Priscilla will grow bolder now, seeing Callum's fall as proof that caution accomplishes little against determination. We should prepare ourselves for whatever she attempts next." Ilara nodded slowly, though she found herself unafraid despite the warning in his words. "Then we will prepare," she said simply. "Together." Days had passed since Callum's arrest, and the palace had slowly begun settling back into its familiar rhythms, though an undercurrent of tension remained, whispered conversations that quieted whenever Ilara passed, careful glances exchanged among nobles, still uncertain how to regard her growing place within Cade's confidence. She had grown more accustomed to such attention over recent weeks, though it never fully stopped unsettling her, the constant awareness that her every action was being measured and discussed by people who had known privilege and title their entire lives, while she had known only thread and quiet poverty until recently. The formal announcement came without warning, a court gathering called under the pretense of celebrating the kingdom's safety following Callum's arrest, though Ilara suspected almost immediately that something else entirely was about to unfold. She stood near Cade at the front of the great hall, dressed in a simple but elegant gown provided for the occasion, painfully aware of how many eyes tracked her every movement. Priscilla arrived late, deliberately so, sweeping into the hall with an entourage of attendants and an expression of calm confidence that immediately set Ilara's nerves on edge. Something about the careful composure Priscilla wore, so different from the raw fury of their earlier confrontation, suggested a plan carefully constructed, rather than emotion allowed to spill freely. "My lord," Priscilla said, offering a graceful bow toward Cade, before turning her attention deliberately toward the gathered court. "I wonder if I might address the assembly briefly, regarding matters that concern us all." Cade's expression remained carefully neutral, though Ilara noticed the slight tension gathering in his shoulders. "You may speak, Priscilla, though I trust your words will be more measured than our previous exchange." "Of course," Priscilla said smoothly, turning to face the assembled nobles with practiced grace. I wish only to raise a concern many of us share, though few have found the courage to voice it directly." She paused deliberately, allowing tension to build within the silent hall before continuing. "Our king has chosen to elevate a seamstress from the lower village to a position of remarkable closeness within this court. I understand the sentiment behind such a choice, truly I do. But I ask this assembly, does anyone here know anything substantial about this woman's history? Her family? Her true intentions in seeking such closeness to the throne?" Murmurs rippled through the gathered court, and Alara felt her chest tighten with familiar dread, though this time she forced herself to stand tall, rather than allow fear to show visibly on her features. She had faced worse than whispered suspicion in recent weeks. She would not crumble now. "My family were simple weavers and seamstresses for generations," Ilara said clearly, before Cade could respond on her behalf. "My mother taught me everything I know, and she passed 2 winters ago, leaving me alone in this world with nothing but my skill and my honesty. I have never once sought closeness to this throne for any reason beyond the service I was asked to provide." "How convenient," Priscilla said, her voice sharpening slightly despite her earlier composure, "that such humble origins have led so swiftly to a position most noble daughters spend their entire lives seeking." "I did not seek this position," Alara said firmly. "It was offered, and I accepted honestly, without scheme or manipulation. If my presence here troubles you, Lady Priscilla, I suspect the trouble lies less with my origins and more with expectations that were never truly promised to you in the first place." A ripple of quiet murmurs followed her words, several nobles exchanging glances that suggested growing sympathy toward Alara's composed defense, rather than Priscilla's calculated accusation. She recognized, standing there beneath the weight of so many watching eyes, that this moment mattered far beyond simply defending her own honor. Every word she spoke now would shape how this court remembered her, whether as a woman who had earned her place through honesty, or as someone easily dismissed the moment ambition chose to challenge her. She refused to let it be the latter. Priscilla's careful expression flickered slightly, clearly unsettled by Alara's unexpected steadiness. "Perhaps," Priscilla said, recovering quickly. "But humble origins do not simply erase the danger of allowing someone so unknown such influence over matters of state. Was she not present during discussions regarding troop movements? Did she not sit quietly through conversations most nobles in this very hall have never been permitted to witness?" Cade stepped forward then, his voice cutting through the murmurs with quiet, controlled authority. "Alara's presence during those discussions was my choice, made with full awareness of the risks involved. I do not require this council's permission to determine who I trust, Priscilla, and I will not allow further attempts to undermine her character through implication and suspicion, rather than actual evidence." "Evidence," Priscilla repeated, something desperate creeping into her carefully composed voice. "Is that truly what you require, my lord? Very well. I have evidence enough that questions should be raised. Evidence that this woman has, in a matter of mere weeks, secured influence that noble families have sought for generations through proper alliance and sacrifice. Influence born of trust, not manipulation," Cade said firmly. "You mistake genuine connection for scheming ambition, simply because you cannot accept that my choices are my own to make." The hall had grown thoroughly silent now, every noble present watching the exchange with rapt attention, some clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation, others leaning forward with obvious curiosity about how the moment would ultimately resolve. "I have served this kingdom's interests faithfully," Priscilla said, her voice rising with barely restrained emotion. "My family has offered alliance, stability, generations of loyal service, and you would cast that aside for a woman whose only qualification is that she happened to catch your eye while mending a torn cloak? You mistake my meaning entirely, if you believe this is simply about a cloak," Cade said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even Priscilla's mounting frustration. "This is about honesty. About choosing someone who has shown me courage, integrity, and genuine care, rather than calculated ambition, dressed carefully in the language of alliance and stability." Priscilla's composure finally cracked entirely, years of careful expectation crumbling visibly across her features. "You would humiliate me before this entire court. For her? I would simply ask you to accept, finally, that this choice was never yours to make," Cade said, his voice softening slightly despite its firmness, some genuine sympathy threading through his controlled authority. "I am sorry if that truth is painful, Priscilla. but continuing to fight against it only causes further harm, to yourself as much as to anyone else. The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, Priscilla standing rigid before the entire gathered court, her ambitions laid bare and thoroughly dismantled in front of witnesses who would carry word of this moment throughout the kingdom by morning. Finally, she straightened with visible effort, gathering the remaining fragments of her composure. "Then I have nothing further to say," she said quietly, her voice stripped of its earlier confidence. She offered a stiff, shallow bow and withdrew from the hall, her attendants following quickly behind her, leaving behind a chamber filled with hushed whispers and careful, considering glances directed toward Alara. Cade turned toward Alara once the doors closed behind Priscilla's departure, his expression carrying equal parts relief and lingering concern. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, close enough now that only she could hear his words clearly. "I am well," Alara said, though her hands trembled slightly with the aftermath of confrontation. "Though I suspect Priscilla's pride has suffered wounds that will not heal easily." "Perhaps not," Cade agreed, "but I will not allow her wounded pride to dictate choices that matter far too much to compromise, regardless of how uncomfortable the path toward honesty proves to be." The gathered court slowly began to disperse, nobles exchanging quiet conversations as they filed from the hall, though Alara noticed several pausing to offer her small, respectful nods as they passed, a marked change from the wary suspicion that had greeted her only weeks before. Whatever Priscilla's intentions had been in orchestrating this public confrontation, it seemed to have accomplished the opposite of what she desired, cementing rather than undermining Alara's place within the court's regard. As the hall finally emptied, Cade reached for Alara's hand, his gray eyes carrying a warmth that steadied every lingering nerve still trembling within her chest. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "I believe the most difficult battles may finally be behind us." Alara wanted desperately to believe him, though some quiet instinct within her chest warned that peace, once disturbed so thoroughly by ambition and betrayal, rarely settled again without one final test still waiting to be faced. That night, alone in her room, Alara replayed every moment of the confrontation, surprised at her own steadiness beneath such public scrutiny. She thought of her mother, of the quiet lessons learned over years spent bent over needlework in their small home, patience, precision, the value of standing firmly behind honest work rather than empty pretense. She had never imagined those same lessons would one day serve her in a palace hall, defending her place beside a king, before an entire court of nobles. She thought too of Priscilla's shattered composure, the raw vulnerability that had briefly shone through years of careful ambition, and found, to her own surprise, that she felt no triumph in the woman's defeat, only a quiet, tired relief that the confrontation had finally reached its end. Whatever bitterness Priscilla still carried, Alara hoped it would fade eventually into something less consuming, though she suspected pride wounded so publicly rarely healed quickly or gracefully. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind still turning over the day's events, though beneath the exhaustion lay something steadier now, a growing confidence that she had truly earned her place within these walls, not through scheme or manipulation, but through honesty freely given, and courage found when it mattered most. Snow had begun falling softly over the palace grounds when Cade summoned the entire court once more, though this time, the invitation carried none of the tension that had marked previous gatherings. Alara stood near her small window that morning, watching delicate flakes drift past the glass, her heart carrying a nervous anticipation she could not fully explain, though something in Cade's manner over recent days had suggested this gathering would be different from anything before it. He had been quieter lately, thoughtful in ways that made her wonder what occupied his mind so completely, though he had offered no explanation beyond gentle reassurances that all was well. He had been quieter lately, thoughtful in ways that made her wonder what occupied his mind so completely, though he had offered no explanation beyond gentle reassurances that all was well. Alara had noticed him disappearing into quiet conversations with Doran on several occasions, conversations that ended abruptly whenever she entered the room, though she told herself it was likely nothing more than continued matters of state following Callum's arrest. Still, a small part of her wondered if something else entirely occupied his thoughts, something he was not yet ready to share. When the summons arrived that morning, requesting her presence in the great hall dressed in her finest clothing, Alara felt certain something significant was about to unfold. The hall, when she arrived, looked nothing like the tense chamber where Priscilla's ambitions had finally crumbled weeks before. Warm light spilled from countless candles, and the assembled nobles wore expressions of curious anticipation, rather than the wary suspicion that had once greeted her. Doran stood near the front of the gathering, offering her a small, genuine smile as she passed, a gesture that would have seemed impossible during their very first meeting. Cade stood at the center of the hall, dressed formally in dark colors that made his gray eyes appear even more striking beneath the candlelight. When his gaze found her across the crowded room, something soft and unguarded passed openly across his features, visible to the entire watching court. "Thank you all for gathering today," Cade said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "Recent months have tested this kingdom in ways none of us anticipated. Betrayal within our own walls, danger along our borders, ambitions that threaten to tear apart the trust this court depends upon to function." He paused, his gaze finding Alara once more before continuing. "Through all of it, one person has shown me courage and honesty that I have found nowhere else in this kingdom, not among nobles born to privilege, not among advisors trained since childhood in the careful language of court politics. She found her way into rooms she never sought to enter, faced dangers she never asked to face, and remained steady through every trial this crown has placed before her." Alara's breath caught as murmurs rippled through the gathered court, understanding beginning to dawn even before Cade spoke the words directly. "Alara," Cade said, crossing the hall to stand directly before her, his gray eyes holding hers with a warmth that made the entire watching court fade into distant background. "You came into my life mending a torn cloak, believing your purpose here was simple and temporary. Instead, you mended something far more broken than fabric. You showed me that trust need not always end in betrayal, that closeness need not always invite danger, that a crown this heavy could still be carried alongside genuine companionship rather than solitary burden." He knelt then, before the entire assembled court, drawing a soft gasp from several nobles who understood immediately the significance of the gesture from a king who had never once shown such vulnerability in public before. "I am asking you, before this court and before this kingdom, to become my mate," Cade said quietly, though his voice carried clearly enough for every witness to hear. "Not because obligation demands it, not because alliance requires it, but because I cannot imagine facing whatever challenges still await this kingdom, without you standing steadily beside me." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Alara's eyes as she looked down at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his gaze, by the weight of everything they had faced together since that first terrifying summons weeks before. She thought of her mother, of the small house she had left behind, of every moment of fear and courage that had led her to this exact place, standing before a king who had chosen her freely, without expectation or obligation forcing his hand. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, though certainty rang clearly beneath it. "Yes, Cade, I will." The hall erupted into warm applause, nobles rising from their seats, genuine joy visible on many faces that had once regarded her with wary suspicion. Cade rose slowly, drawing her into an embrace that lasted long enough to still feel private despite the watching crowd, his lips finding hers in a gentle kiss that sealed everything words alone could not fully express. When they finally parted, Doran approached with visible emotion breaking through his usually stern composure. "It is about time," he said gruffly, though warmth softened every word. "I confess, I have watched this unfold since that very first council meeting, wondering how long it would take either of you to admit what had already grown so clearly between you." "Patience was never my strongest virtue," Cade admitted, a genuine smile crossing his features as he kept Alara close beside him. "Nor mine," Alara added softly, earning a warm laugh from Doran that echoed pleasantly through the joyful hall. In the weeks that followed, preparations began for a formal coronation ceremony, one that would recognize Alara not simply as Cade's chosen mate, but as future queen alongside him. She spent hours learning the customs and expectations of her new position, though Cade remained close throughout, ensuring she never faced the transition entirely alone. Servants who had once regarded her with cautious distance now greeted her with genuine warmth, understanding perhaps that her rise had come not through scheming ambition, but through honesty and courage freely given. She wrote to distant relatives she had not spoken with in years, sharing news of the remarkable turn her life had taken, and received warm, disbelieving replies, filled with joy and gentle teasing about the seamstress who had somehow captured a king's heart. She visited her old house in the lower village, one final time, before it was given over to a young family in need, standing quietly in the small room, where she had once mended garments for coin, barely enough to feed herself, grateful for every hardship that had shaped her into someone capable of meeting the challenges still waiting within palace walls. Word arrived eventually that Priscilla had withdrawn entirely from court life, retreating to her family's estate far from the palace, her ambitions finally laid to rest, alongside whatever pride still lingered from her public defeat. Callum, meanwhile, faced formal judgment before the full council. His fate ultimately settled through proper legal proceedings that ensured justice without the chaos his own actions had once threatened to unleash upon the kingdom. On the morning of the coronation, snow blanketed the palace grounds in soft white silence, the world outside hushed and peaceful, in a way that felt fitting for such a significant occasion. Ilara stood before a tall mirror in her private chambers, dressed in deep blue fabric, embroidered with silver thread she had helped design herself, a final touch of the skill that had first brought her into Cade's life all those months before. When she finally walked into the great hall, transformed now with banners and flowers despite the winter season outside, she found Cade waiting at the front, his expression carrying a pride and tenderness that steadied every remaining nerve within her chest. The ceremony proceeded with solemn beauty, ancient words spoken carefully by the kingdom's eldest advisor, crowns exchanged, vows spoken clearly before the entire gathered court and the many villagers who had traveled from the lower village to witness the moment. Ilara caught sight of familiar faces scattered among the crowd, the baker who had once sold her bread on credit during difficult winters, the old woman who had taught her mother to sew decades before, neighbors who had known her only as a quiet, hard-working seamstress, and now watched with tears of joy as she stood transformed before them. She felt, standing there beneath the weight of crown and ceremony, a profound gratitude for every hardship that had shaped her path, understanding now that none of it had been wasted, each difficult year simply preparing her for the strength this new life would demand. As the final words were spoken, declaring Ilara officially queen alongside Cade's continued reign, the hall erupted into celebration, warmth and joy filling every corner of a space that had once held such danger and uncertainty. Ilara looked out across the gathered crowd, recognizing faces from her old life mixed among the nobility she had grown to know. A beautiful blending of two worlds she had never imagined could exist together so harmoniously. Later that evening, as celebrations continued throughout the palace, Cade found a quiet moment to draw Ilara aside, away from the noise and joy, into the same tall room where their story had first begun weeks before. The torn cloak she had mended that very first day still hung carefully preserved nearby, a quiet reminder of how far they had traveled together since that uncertain morning. "Do you remember?" Cade asked softly. "How frightened you looked, standing exactly where you stand now, certain I intended you some terrible harm?" Ilara laughed softly, warmth spreading through her chest at the memory. "I remember thinking I might never leave this room alive," she admitted. "I certainly never imagined I would one day return to it as your queen." "Neither did I," Cade said quietly, drawing her close against him, his gray eyes holding a peace she had never witnessed during their earliest meetings. "I thought I understood loneliness well enough to accept it as permanent. I never imagined a torn cloak could lead me towards something so entirely different." "Perhaps," Ilara said softly, resting her head gently against his shoulder. "Some things are simply meant to find their way toward one another, no matter how unlikely the path first appears." Outside, snow continued falling gently over the palace grounds, blanketing the kingdom in peaceful white silence, while within its walls, a king who had once ruled through careful distance and quiet solitude now stood wrapped instead in genuine love, found unexpectedly through nothing more than a single torn cloak and the steady hands of a seamstress who had never once imagined the life waiting for her beyond that first terrifying summons. Their story, born from danger and betrayal, had finally settled into something lasting, a partnership built not upon obligation or expectation, but upon the rarest foundation of all, honest trust freely given and courageously returned.